that morning, Jordan had asked the nurse to call Daniel. The words hit him like physical blows. Their son was sick. Jordan was alone at the hospital with a sick child, the child they could have raised together, and he'd given Daniel's number as emergency contact despite 2 years of silence. The phone slipped slightly in Daniel's suddenly trembling hand. Mount Sinai, emergency department. Daniel was already heading toward the door when he realized his assistant was staring at him with concern. Cancel everything, he told her. Cancel Aspen. Cancel the meetings. Cancel everything. As he rushed toward the elevator, one thought pounded through his mind with devastating clarity. For 2 years, he'd been running from love disguised as responsibility. And now the child who could have been his son needed him. Welcome to Heart Stories, where love finds a way through the deepest pain. Before we continue this journey of redemption and healing, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Every story we share reminds us that family isn't just blood. It's the courage to choose love when the world tells you not to. Now, let's discover what Daniel found when he finally stopped running. The drive to Mount Sinai felt like an eternity. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Traffic moved at a maddeningly slow pace, and every red light felt like a personal insult from the universe. He tried to prepare himself for what he would find at the hospital, but his mind kept circling back to the devastating realization that he had never even seen Benji's face in person. When he finally reached the hospital parking garage, Daniel sat in his car for a full minute, staring at the concrete wall in front of him. His expensive wool coat suddenly felt suffocating. His hands were trembling, actually trembling, like some nervous teenager instead of a man who'd built $1 billion empire from nothing. Through the small window in the door of room 247, Daniel could see him. Jordan looked exactly the same, yet completely different. His auburn hair was longer now, pulled back in a messy bun that suggested he'd been up all night. He wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, both wrinkled from hours of worry. But what struck Daniel most was the look of absolute exhaustion on his face. Not just physical tiredness, but the bone-deep weariness that came from carrying the world alone for too long. In his arms was a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Benji, the child, was clearly unwell, his face flushed with fever, and even through the glass, Daniel could see the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest. Benji's hair was dark, his delicate features reminiscent of Jordan's sister, Sarah, even sick and sleeping. He was beautiful. Daniel knocked softly before entering. Jordan looked up, and for a moment their eyes met across 2 years of silence and regret. There was no anger in Jordan's tone, no accusation, just simple acknowledgement of his presence, as if Daniel had been gone for 20 minutes instead of 24 months. The doctor had diagnosed bronchiolitis, a viral infection. Benji's oxygen levels were stable, but his fever had spiked that morning. They wanted to keep him for observation, maybe overnight. Daniel moved closer, close enough to see the delicate curve of Benji's eyelashes, the way his tiny fist was curled against Jordan's sweater. Daniel mentioned his abandoned travel plans, immediately regretting how selfish that sounded. Jordan nodded without judgment, understanding it was Christmas week. He wouldn't have given them Daniel's number, but his voice caught slightly as he explained 8 hours of dealing with this alone. Benji's labored breathing, the fear that had driven him to reach out to the only person who might understand the weight of loving this child. The admission hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Jordan Mitchell didn't scare easily. In the years they'd been together, Daniel had seen him handle crisis after crisis with calm determination. If he was scared enough to call Daniel, he must have been terrified. Before Daniel could respond, Benji stirred in Jordan's arms. His eyes fluttered open, gray-green like his late mother's, looking directly at Daniel with the unfocused curiosity of a sick toddler. For a moment, the child seemed to recognize something familiar, something safe. Daniel watched Jordan's face carefully blank as Benji reached one tiny hand toward him. Without thinking, Daniel extended his finger. The child's grip was surprisingly strong, surprisingly warm. In that moment, sitting in a sterile hospital room with this sick little boy's hand wrapped around his finger, Daniel understood with crystalline clarity that every single day he'd stayed away had been a betrayal. A nurse appeared in the doorway, requesting to speak with both guardians about Benji's treatment plan. Daniel started to correct her, to explain he wasn't actually family, but Jordan caught his eye and shook his head, almost imperceptibly. For the first time in 2 years, Daniel didn't feel like an outsider looking in on the family he'd abandoned. Amanda Reeves delivered the news with gentle authority. Benji would be fine, but they'd want to keep him overnight for monitoring. As she explained the treatment plan, Daniel found himself leaning forward, studying the medical charts as if he could somehow decode them himself. He realized with a start that he had no idea what a normal toddler's medical history should look like. When Dr. Reeves asked about family medical history, Daniel felt heat rise in his face. Another basic piece of information about this child that he should know, but didn't. As the consultation ended and they returned to Benji's room, the weight of 2 years of absence settled over Daniel like a heavy blanket. Jordan had been doing this alone. Every fever, every sleepless night, every moment of joy and terror that came with raising a child who'd already experienced more loss than most adults. Daniel realized that the love he'd been too afraid to claim had been quietly growing without him, resilient and fierce and absolutely beautiful. That night, as Benji slept fitfully in his hospital bed, Daniel and Jordan sat in awkward silence. Finally, Jordan spoke about his sister Sarah, how she'd struggled with her identity in a world that seemed determined to reject everything authentic about her. She'd died alone, convinced that love was something she'd never deserved to keep. When the family had refused to take Benji, citing their religious beliefs about Sarah's lifestyle, Jordan had stepped forward without hesitation. He'd been raising his nephew alone, pouring all the love he'd once hoped to share with Daniel into this child who desperately needed to know that some families choose each other, that belonging doesn't always follow bloodlines. The hospital discharge took longer than expected. Benji's fever had broken completely, but the paperwork and medication instructions stretched well into the afternoon. By the time they were loading a much more alert and cheerful Benji into Daniel's Tesla, the winter sun was already beginning its descent toward the Manhattan skyline. Benji was fascinated by the car, pressing his small palms against the leather seats and babbling excitedly at the digital dashboard. He kept pointing out the window at passing buses, shouting with the enthusiasm only a toddler could muster. Watching this child discover the world with such pure joy was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. 2 years of wonder that Daniel had missed completely. As they drove from Manhattan to Queens, Daniel began to understand exactly what Jordan's life had become. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it was a far cry from the tree-lined streets where Daniel lived. Here, the buildings were closer together, older, with less green space and more concrete. The sounds were different too. More traffic, more sirens, more of the urban chaos that never quite stopped. Jordan's apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up in Woodside, the kind of building that had seen better decades. Getting Benji and his medical supplies up the narrow stairs was an adventure, especially when the elevator was broken again. According to Jordan's resigned explanation, they had to navigate around neighbors and navigate Benji's excitement about every interesting detail along the way. The apartment itself was tiny, but filled with love. The living room, kitchen, and dining area were all one small space, with a narrow hallway leading to what Daniel assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. Despite Jordan's obvious efforts to make it cheerful with bright throw pillows and Benji's colorful toys, it felt cramped and dark compared to what Daniel knew they could afford together. What struck Daniel most were the details that told the story of their life. Benji's high chair squeezed into the tiny kitchen, a laundry basket that doubled as a toy chest, books stacked everywhere because there wasn't enough shelf space, the small table that served as both dining surface and Jordan's work desk, his laptop pushed to one side to make room for Benji's activities. On the bookshelf, carefully preserved in a small frame, was a photograph of Sarah holding newborn Benji. Beside it were several letters, and Daniel caught glimpses of familiar handwriting before Jordan quietly moved to close the drawer. But not before Daniel saw what appeared to be official documents, legal papers, and what looked like rejection letters from adoption agencies. Jordan showed him Benji's room, a space barely large enough for a toddler bed, a small dresser, and nothing else. The cheerful train-patterned curtains that Jordan had obviously hung to make the windowless space feel less claustrophobic couldn't hide the reality that this child's entire world fit into a space smaller than Daniel's walk-in closet. As they sat in the small living room that evening, Benji playing contentedly with his blocks, Jordan finally told him the whole truth. After Sarah's death, he'd applied to dozens of adoption agencies, only to be turned away repeatedly. Some cited his single status, others, his sexuality. Most offered polite euphemisms for their discomfort with placing a vulnerable child with someone like him. The legal battle with Sarah's family had been brutal. They'd fought for custody not because they wanted Benji, but because they couldn't bear the thought of him being raised in what they called an unnatural environment. Jordan had spent every penny of his savings on legal fees, fighting for the right to love this child who had no one else in the world. When he'd finally won custody, the adoption agency's attitudes hadn't changed much. The process that should have taken months had stretched into years, with endless evaluations, home visits, and psychological assessments designed to find reasons why a gay man shouldn't be trusted with a child's well-being. Daniel listened to this story with growing horror and admiration. While he'd been building his empire and nursing his fears about commitment, Jordan had been fighting an entire system for the right to provide a loving home for a child who'd already lost everything. The courage that required, the daily choice to keep believing in love when the world seemed determined to prove it impossible, was staggering. That night, as they put Benji through his bedtime routine, Daniel found himself thinking about his father's hidden letters, the ones he discovered after the suicide. Page after page of anguished writing about a young man he'd tried to help years earlier, a boy thrown out by his family for being gay, who'd reminded his father of everything he had been too afraid to acknowledge about himself. His father had wanted to help, had even started adoption proceedings, but fear had stopped him. Fear of exposure, fear of judgment, fear of living authentically in a world that punished honesty. The boy had eventually died by suicide, and Daniel's father had carried that guilt until it consumed him entirely. Standing in Jordan's tiny apartment, watching this man who'd chosen courage over safety again and again, Daniel finally understood what his father had died trying to teach him. Love wasn't something you waited to be ready for. It was something you chose, again and again, despite the fear, despite the world's attempts to convince you that you weren't worthy of it. The system that had tried to keep Jordan from adopting Benji was the same system that had convinced his father he was too broken to save anyone, including himself. But Jordan had fought through it, had refused to let fear make his choices for him. He'd created something beautiful and lasting in the face of overwhelming opposition. Daniel woke the next morning to the sound of tiny feet and Benji's delighted announcement that Daniel was still there. He'd spent the night on Jordan's small couch, his long frame cramped and uncomfortable, but he'd slept better than he had in months. For the first time in 2 years, he'd fallen asleep to the sounds of family life rather than the empty echo of his penthouse. As Jordan prepared Benji's breakfast with practiced efficiency, Daniel's phone began buzzing insistently, even powered off the night before. It had apparently turned itself back on, and now it was vibrating with dozens of messages and missed calls. His assistant's name appeared repeatedly, along with several board members and his business partner. Jordan glanced at the phone, noting someone named Rebecca had called repeatedly. Daniel almost ignored it, but the urgency was unmistakable. When he finally answered, Rebecca's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. The board was in crisis mode. The Yamamoto deal, worth $47 million, was falling apart because Daniel had missed yesterday's crucial conference call with Tokyo. Yamamoto Industries was threatening to pull their contract, citing concerns about Daniel's commitment and availability for negotiations. The board had called an emergency meeting, and Marcus was talking about calling for a vote of no confidence in Daniel's leadership. The company that Daniel had spent 15 years building was crumbling because he'd chosen to stay overnight in a cramped Queens apartment to make sure a sick child felt safe. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own father had built a successful business while hiding his true self, maintaining the perfect facade of heterosexual respectability until the pressure had literally killed him. Now Daniel was facing the opposite choice, risking everything he'd built for the chance to live authentically, to choose love over profit margins and board approval. From the kitchen, he could hear Benji's delighted laughter as he helped measure coffee grounds, most of which were ending up on the floor. Jordan was patiently cleaning up the mess while maintaining an animated conversation about the proper coffee-to-water ratio with someone who was far more interested in the mechanical process than the actual beverage. Rebecca was explaining the severity of the situation. If they didn't respond immediately, Yamamoto would move forward with Henderson Corporation. The Asian expansion that Daniel had been planning for 3 years would disappear overnight. Stock prices would plummet. Investor confidence would evaporate. As Rebecca spoke, Daniel found himself thinking about the photograph of his father he kept in his office, the one taken the year before his suicide. In it, his father looked successful, respected, completely in control. No one looking at that image would have guessed the tremendous effort it took for him to maintain that facade, or the price he paid for it in isolation and self-hatred. Daniel had spent his entire adult life trying not to become his father, but he'd been doing it wrong. He'd thought the danger was in being weak, in being vulnerable, in needing other people. But the real danger was in choosing safety over truth, in building a life so carefully controlled that there was no room left for actual living. When Rebecca finished her urgent explanation, Daniel made a decision that surprised even him. He would attend the board meeting, but not to apologize or make excuses. He would tell them exactly why his priorities were changing, and if they couldn't accept that, they could find another CEO. The video conference was unlike any business meeting Daniel had ever conducted. He sat at Jordan's small kitchen table with his laptop, trying to negotiate the most important deal of his career, while Benji played quietly at his feet, occasionally offering him toy cars and whispering in the reverent tone children use for adult mysteries they didn't understand. For an hour, Daniel orchestrated what amounted to a complete reorganization of his company's management structure. He promoted Rebecca to vice president of operations, gave Marcus full authority over international negotiations, and established a system where he could maintain strategic oversight without the grinding daily travel that had defined his previous life. Board member Patricia Holbrook observed that he was essentially stepping back from day-to-day operations. Asking if this was a permanent change, Daniel glanced at Jordan, who was making lunch while trying to pretend he wasn't listening to every word of the conversation. The tension in Jordan's shoulders, the way he gripped the knife a little too tightly while cutting sandwiches, revealed how much this moment mattered. Daniel's response was carefully calculated but absolutely honest. He was building a sustainable business model that didn't require the CEO to be available 24 hours a day. Companies that depended on one person's constant presence weren't really companies. They were elaborate consulting practices. It was a good answer, and it was also a complete reversal of everything he'd believed about leadership for the past 15 years. When the call ended with grudging agreement from the board and a rescheduled conference with Yamamoto, Daniel closed the laptop to find Jordan staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That sounded like a major restructuring. Jordan observed carefully. It was, Daniel replied simply, he just delegated away 70% of his previous responsibilities. Jordan's response surprised him. How did he know this wasn't just another version of running away? What happened when the novelty wore off and Daniel realized he missed the thrill of closing major deals? The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Jordan thought he was being reactive, not committed. There was a difference between changing priorities and abandoning them entirely. What happened when staying home for bedtime stories started to feel suffocating instead of meaningful? Before Daniel could answer, Benji woke from his nap and immediately started crying. Not the gentle fussing of a child who needed comfort, but the full-throated wailing of someone genuinely distressed. Nothing they tried seemed to help. Benji pushed away from Jordan, arched his back away from Daniel, and continued crying with a relentless intensity that only toddlers could sustain. This was the reality check Jordan had been afraid to voice directly. This was what commitment looked like when it wasn't heartwarming or Instagram-worthy. Parenting wasn't reading bedtime stories and morning coffee routines. It was crying you couldn't stop, problems you couldn't solve, hours where nothing you did seemed to help. 3 weeks later, Daniel's new life had settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined. He'd moved into a hotel in Queens, not because Jordan had asked him to stay close, but because the commute to Manhattan felt like crossing continents when Benji had a fever or Jordan needed support during a work crisis. The business was surviving his reduced involvement better than anyone had predicted. That morning brought another emergency call. Benji's fever was back, climbing to dangerous levels, and Jordan was heading to the emergency room alone again. But this time was different. This time, Daniel wasn't a stranger fumbling through an unfamiliar crisis. He was someone who knew Benji's favorite comfort toy, his preferred position for being held when sick, and exactly how to distract him during medical procedures. As they sat in the same emergency department where their journey had begun, Jordan finally voiced what had been building for weeks. He couldn't keep doing the in-between thing they were doing. Daniel showing up for emergencies, and then going back to his hotel, then showing up again when needed. It was confusing for Benji, and it was breaking Jordan's heart. Every time Daniel left, Benji asked when Daddy was coming back. Every time Daniel showed up, Jordan remembered what it felt like when they were family. He couldn't keep hoping for something that might not be real. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he realized what Jordan was asking for. Not just presence, but commitment. Not just help, but belonging. When Benji stirred in the hospital bed, opening fever-bright eyes and immediately reaching for both of them, the child's satisfied announcement that both his parents were there hit Daniel like a revelation. Benji settled between them with the contentment of a child who had everything he needed within arm's reach. Jordan's question hung in the air like a challenge. What did Daniel want to do about this impossible situation they'd created? Before Daniel could answer, Benji had fallen asleep again, but his small hands were holding on to both his parents. One finger wrapped around Jordan's thumb, the other clutching Daniel's sleeve. Daniel's response came from a place deeper than business strategy or careful planning. He wanted to come home, not to some fantasy version of their life where everything was perfect, but to the real thing. The middle of the night fevers and the grocery store meltdowns and the tiny apartment where there was no space for anyone to hide from their feelings. Jordan's conditions were non-negotiable. If Daniel came home, it had to be real, not a trial period, not an experiment, not something he could walk away from when it got hard. It had to be forever. Forever was exactly the right amount of time to promise when talking about being someone's father. The legal adoption process that followed was more complex than Daniel had anticipated. The system that had made Jordan fight for 2 years wasn't immediately welcoming to the idea of a gay couple adopting together. But this time they had resources, legal representation, and most importantly, they had each other. The court hearing where Daniel officially became Benji's father was small and private, attended only by close friends and the social worker who'd finally approved their application. When the judge declared the adoption final, Benji clapped excitedly from Jordan's lap, not understanding the legal significance, but recognizing that something important and good was happening. 6 months later, the new apartment in Park Slope was everything the Queen's Place hadn't been. Spacious, bright, with enough room for Benji to run his toy cars without crashing into furniture every few seconds. But what made it special wasn't the extra square footage or the working elevator or even the small backyard where Benji could play safely. What made it special was the sound that filled it every morning, the laughter of a family who had learned to choose each other again and again through sleepless nights and minor emergencies and the 1,000 ordinary moments that made up a life together. Daniel stood in the kitchen attempting to flip pancakes while Benji helped by providing commentary on proper pancake flipping technique. The business was thriving under its new structure. The Yamamoto deal had closed successfully, with Marcus proving surprisingly capable of handling international negotiations. Daniel had discovered that strategic oversight was both more challenging and more rewarding than the tactical firefighting that had consumed his previous life. But perhaps more importantly, Daniel had quietly established the Richardson Foundation, dedicated to supporting LGBT adoption and family services. The foundation's first initiative was lobbying for changes to adoption laws that made it easier for same-sex couples to provide loving homes for children who needed them. As they walked to the park that morning, Benji chattering excitedly about swings and slides and the possibility of seeing dogs, Daniel found himself thinking about his father's letters, the guilt and regret that had consumed him, the belief that he was too broken to save anyone, including himself. Daniel had learned that healing didn't require perfection, just courage. Standing in that playground, watching Benji run toward the swings with unbridled joy, while Jordan took his hand with the casual intimacy of someone who trusted him to stay. Daniel understood that love wasn't something you waited to be ready for. It was something you chose again and again despite the fear. Some gifts came disguised as emergencies. Some of the most important decisions happened in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. Sometimes the call you almost didn't answer turned out to be an invitation to the life you never knew you wanted, but always needed. The courage to choose love over fear, family over safety, had transformed not just Daniel's life, but created ripples of change that would touch countless other families struggling to find acceptance in a world that too often turned away. Have you ever discovered that the thing you feared most was actually the key to everything you'd been searching for? Share your thoughts below about the power of chosen family and authentic love. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more tales of courage, healing, and the families we create when we're brave enough to love without conditions.